that they are not free Negroes or mulattoes, but they are of Indian descent, and that each of them have a certificate separately thereof, particularly for Native Americans. So classified as M or mulatto, these individuals were stripped of their rightful heritage on paper, and there's consequences to that. Hi, I'm Danielle Romero. Thank you so much for being with me here on my channel, where we've been digging into American identity, family stories. We're running into some issues with YouTube. I was concerned that I might be getting deplatformed. Thank you so much for all the support and the love, and all of the people who signed up for the email list. If you want to sign up so we can stay connected, I'll leave a link below. I'm still trying to work out what to do with that. And I also just got on Twitter, or X, at I'm Finding Lola, and I'd love to have you join me over there. So this is going to be probably the most controversial video I've ever filmed, which is saying a lot. I don't think it should be controversial, but I want to give two caveats before we jump in. One, even if this is not your story or doesn't have anything to do with your family, I think understanding our neighbor's history is important. And so I encourage you to watch this. And I would also encourage you to watch the work I've done on the Italian American experience, the Irish American experience, the Polish American experience. The second part is that I will never, ever erase African American history. I've been blessed enough to be able to trace an ancestor, or like fifth great grandfather, from Africa across the Middle Passage to the plantation in New Orleans where he was then enslaved, and connect that all the way to my family. I think that sometimes when we start delving into this Black, Indian, mulatto thing, we look at it as an either or. It's either this is true or this is true. And I think we need to look at this as a both and. We can have two things be true at the same time, and it doesn't negate the other necessarily. So this video might get uncomfortable. Stick with me. And after you watch it, if you feel like this is a conversation that needs to happen on a broader scale, would you share this video and help it get out there? We don't all need to agree, but I think we need to all be a part of the conversation. We're going to embark on a journey today through time and terminology, particularly with the term mulatto. Now, I know that's a loaded term, and a lot of my family has been described as mulatto on census records, and it's often perceived as a label for those who are of European and African descent. And if you were to look it up, the definition would quite literally be someone who's basically half European, half African descent. But historical documentation sometimes contradicts that narrow view. It reveals a surprising and very overlooked narrative. This is the application of the designation mulatto to individuals of Native American ancestry. So this isn't just an academic exploration. I'm going to share documents from some lines of my family. And to me, this is a quest for truth. It's a quest for identity. It's not to create division, but it's to help people connect to their family story. And I think for a lot of us, sometimes we are not professionals, and like I'm not, and I'm trying to find my family, and I think that the path is this way, but I was looking at it wrong, and I really needed to go this way. And I think this is a huge part of that. Now, the Jim Crow era produced no greater champion of this constricted interpretation of mulatto than Walter Plecker, who was the first registrar of Virginia's Bureau of Vital Statistics. That vital statistics, maybe you've dealt with them, that's where you're getting birth certificates, death certificates, stuff like that. He was an avowed white supremacist and an advocate of eugenics. Plecker drafted and lobbied for the passage of Virginia's 1924 Racial Integrity Act. This required the state to only recognize two groups of people: you're white or you're Black. Basically, he said, listen, you're either white or you're Black. We're not doing any more in between. And Plecker personally oversaw the alteration of Virginia birth certificates. I've seen sources say he oversaw all, at that point, death certificates and voter registries, removing Indian and replacing it with Negro or Black. Now I'm going to pause again. I don't think this means that everybody that's listed as mulatto or Black or Negro on a census record is an American Indian. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that there are plenty of American Indians who were labeled as such purposefully. And a woman in New Orleans named Naomi Drake did the exact same thing at the same time. She would try to figure out, like, if someone had died, were they buried in what is considered a black cemetery? And if you attended the funeral as a family member, then you were on the list to have your birth certificate changed. And this had far-reaching effects. We're thinking Jim Crow era, Louisiana. And if your birth certificate got changed from white to black, that is going to completely change what's available to you for jobs, for services, for all kinds of stuff. We're talking about hypodescent. Hypodescent is just a fancy way of saying the one-drop rule. And so it was this idea that you're either white or you're black. Doesn't matter how you look. We're talking about your lineage here. So this is setting the stage for these court cases and anecdotes that I want to discuss with you. I want to talk about a court case that has to do with some of my family, the Goins family. They were, sometimes they're Melungeon, sometimes they're Redbone over here, sometimes they're Native American over here, sometimes they're African American over here. But first we're going to talk about issues of people who were recorded as mulatto but had no African heritage. And remember, people weren't taking DNA tests. We can't know anything for certain, right? And even with today's DNA tests, like, you can't know for certain. But there are many, many examples historically of people that were Native Americans who were documented as black or mulatto, and they had no African heritage. This is in 1871. The North Carolina Joint Senate and House Committee were attempting to ascertain causes and conditions surrounding civil unrest at the Southern Carolina border. And they interviewed Robeson County Judge Giles Leitch about the, quote, free persons of color living within his county. If you know Robeson County, this is, I believe, part of where the Lumbee tribe are. And Leitch was a well-respected lifelong resident of the county, and he was considered an expert witness regarding the racial composition of those in question. So here's what happened. The Senate said, half of the colored population, Leitch, yes, sir, half of the colored population of Robeson County were never slaves at all. Senate, what are they? Are they Negroes? Leitch, well, sir, I desire to tell you the truth as near as I can, but I really do not know what they are. I think they are a mixture of Spanish, Portuguese, and Indian. Senate, you think they are mixed Negroes and Indian? Leitch, I do not think in that class of population there is much Negro blood at all. Of the half of the colored population that I have attempted to describe have always been free. They are called mulattoes. That is a name they are known by, as contra-distinguished from the Negroes. I think they are of Indian origin. This is this man's testimony. It doesn't mean we're going to hang our hat on it forever. This is one example. So the people that he's describing as being a mixture of Spanish, Portuguese, and Indian, when he means Native American, were recorded as M in the census for 1850, 1860, and 1870, meaning for mulatto. There was a newspaper published in North Carolina called the Tri-Weekly Era, and this is from 1871. And there was an article about it. It was called The Robeson Outlaws, Who They Are, The Truth About Them from an Unprejudiced Source. And it described numerous Native American families from Robeson County and how these families were primarily Native American, but they were called mulattoes due to their Indian-white admixture. And this is what the article says. Quote, there is in this country a district of a country of about 10 or 12 miles square, inhabited almost entirely by mulattoes, as we call them here, but really Tuscarora Indians. It contains probably some 200 or more mulatto or Indian families, amounting in all, men, women, and children, to at least 1,000 souls. These ancestors of these people, the Lowrys, the Oxendines, the Locklears, the Cumbos, the Chavises, the Dials, remember, these are Melungeon last names. These are Redbone last names. Come from Halifax County before the old Revolutionary War. And I am informed by the oldest citizens here who have lived by them all their lives that they were always known to be Indians. That some of them are now pure Indian, some are mixed with European, and some with Negro. Their features, their copper color, their straight, coarse black hair, their character for vindictiveness, bloodthirstiness, cunning, this is from 1871, craftiness, their general improvidence, and everything about them is Indian, unquote. These people were listed as M, mulatto, on the census. There's another one from Edgefield District, South Carolina. And in 1859, residents of this town filed a petition to be granted exclusion from the poll tax that was being assessed on, quote, free persons of color. And the petition stated, quote, that the first 6 petitioners' names, above to wit, are the Chavis and Jones families. They are free persons of color being descendants of Indian ancestors. Your petitioners of the Indian blood, that is to say, Frederick, Lewis, and Durrani Chavis, James Bartley, and Mary Jones, may your honorable body to say whether by free persons of color they mean to include the descendants of Indians. There's a poll tax for free persons of color, and they're trying to say, just so you know, we're Native American. Did you mean to include us in this group? Now, again, you're getting names that we've seen come up before, names I've seen in my family line, the Chavis family. South Carolina legislator, what did they do? Well, they actually agreed to these petitioners who were, quote, of Indian descent, and they wouldn't be held to the higher poll taxes against the, quote, free persons of color. So they were distinguishing themselves here. And their Indian descent removed this extra tax burden that people of Negro descent had to pay. It didn't stop them from being called mulatto in the records in 1860, 1870, and beyond. From the beginning of the census records in the 1700s all the way to World War II, there were basically two points to this. It was to allocate congressional representation and give the government a fair estimate of potentially collectible tax revenue. That is to say, like, the reason that this was included for race was to identify the tax status of the individual. Remember, in the 1700s, that was a very different economy, a very different country than we're talking about in the 1940s. So early tax codes only had 3 classes of individuals. They had free white males, free persons of color, and Indians, not taxed. In 1705, Virginia specifically codified this description into a following statute. The child of an Indian and the child, grandchild, or great-grandchild of a Negro shall be deemed, accounted, held, and taken to be a mulatto. A white 19th century lawyer from North Carolina who pressed to define the separate definitions of free Negroes and mulattoes. This is what he said, quote, free Negroes are slaves, and their descendants emancipated by Quakers and other benevolent whites and the owners of them. The mulatto is the offspring between the white and the Negro, or between the Indian and the Negro, or between the white and the Indian. So you can have an instance where you could be considered mulatto, your family, in a tax record, and you have no African ancestry. Now, the United States Census, which was a tool for demographic recording, became an unwitting or possibly purposeful accomplice in this identity erasure. It had a rigid classification system which failed to capture the nuanced realities of racial identity, particularly for Native Americans. So classified as M or mulatto, these individuals were stripped of their rightful heritage on paper, and there's consequences to that. The census's binary approach to race, particularly in the South, led to this widespread categorization of Native Americans as mulattoes. This misclassification was rooted in a legal and social context that we have to take into account. How are people looking at each other? How are they interacting? What did the social hierarchies look like? Who had a voice to be able to even speak out on these topics? So the idea of mulatto being used for anyone of any mixed ancestry, irrespective of their actual racial background, has effects. Now, the examples abound in historical records for this, revealing the flawed nature of these census categorizations. For instance, Lydia E. Cole from Virginia was marked as M in the 1860 census. Her true identity of Native American descent was acknowledged only in a handwritten note by the enumerator. So the enumerator's facing this census with just a couple options. So he decides to put M. He's like, this is the best place to put you. You're not black, you're not white. But then he has to go ahead and write, but she's Native American. Such instances demonstrate the systemic failure to recognize Native American identities. There's another case of William Chavis, or Chavis, which I have this family in my line, in North Carolina, further illustrates this. Despite his legal battle to be recognized as of Indian descent, the census continued to label him as M for mulatto. This persistent mislabeling reflects a broader pattern of erasing Native American identity, maybe even under the guise of census accuracy. They're saying, well, we're not allowed to put a different letter, so you're getting M. Now, the interchangeable use of Indian and mulatto in census records is not just a matter of semantics. It is a reflection of the system. This is the problem I have when we are so hyper-focused on telling people, you belong in this color box, you belong in this color box, you belong in this color box. Most people don't fit perfectly or neatly into these boxes. And you could see here what happens, people are unable to connect to their heritage, their family, their rightful lineage, because these stupid letters are sending them off on a wild goose chase. So the legal ramifications of being labeled mulatto were profound for Native Americans. You don't need me to tell you this, okay? But the classification obviously often resulted in a denial of their political rights or cultural recognition. This is a sobering reminder of how powerful legal definitions can be, how they can shape and even distort our understanding of identity. I want to tell you about 3 families who went to court over their identity. They are the Smilings, the Chavis family, and the Goins family. Now, this story begins just after the Revolutionary War, with several Indian families migrating. And when I say Indian, I mean Native American. It's a time of change, a time of movement. A lot of these families who we would see as Melungeon on the East Coast, they end up coming over to Louisiana and Texas trying to get land. And we see that, but they're still connected. It's still these same families. Robeson County, North Carolina, to Sumter County, South Carolina. There were notable names here. If your family comes from Melungeon or Redbone roots, you might recognize some, like Ammons, Chavis, Locklear, now found themselves documented in the 1810 census of Sumter. Some committee members of the Robeson Indian School questioned their right to attend the school. So these people are coming back and saying, well, obviously we go to the Indian school because we're Native American. And the school's like, yeah, we don't know if you are. And so this kind of opened up a Pandora's box of racial identity and social classification. And so the core issue at hand was that the social separateness of the Native American people, and they were entangled in this legal battle regarding school admissions. So what's happening here is these families are trying to bring forth witnesses to show that they are Native American. Fanny Chavis speaks to the court. I am a daughter of Emma Goins and a sister of the plaintiffs. I have lived in Robeson County 8 years. I attended the Norman School, which is a Native American school, for 4 or 5 years, probably more. I have taught for 6 years. Teach in the Indian public schools, never taught Negroes, nor have I ever associated in church or school with Negroes. The reputation among the people where we live in South Carolina is that we belong to the Indian race of people. My husband's name is Eli Chavis. Then Eli Chavis comes to speak. He said, I am the brother-in-law of the plaintiffs, and I have lived in Robeson County all my life. I belong to the Indian people. I investigated the race and nationality of my wife before I married and learned she belonged to the Indian race. Did not look like there was any Negro blood in my father-in-law, none at all. And then another man, a reverend, comes up. His name's J.J. Bell. He says, I have been a minister of the gospel about 27 years. I have been preaching to the Indian people. I belong to the Indian race. I'm a member of the Burnt Swamp Baptist Association and was one on the committee appointed by the association to investigate whether or not the Goins were Indians and whether or not the Hopewell Church should be admitted into the association. This was several years ago, and Reverend Gilbert Locklear went with me. And if you're thinking, Heather Locklear, I believe that she does have ties to this community. I believe this is her family. I stayed in the Goins house when I was there. The general reputation of those I questioned was that the plaintiffs are Indians, never were slaves, and we reported to the association that they belonged to the Indian race. Now, remember we talked about Dr. Furman. He was the man that was kind of writing back and forth asking about who was a Redbone. Well, a man named W.W. Goins refers to him, and this is what he said. He said, Dr. Furman traced up our origin. He found that we, our parents, went from North Carolina, Oxidine, Hunt, Chavis, and Goins. Now, these names are common in Lumbee lineage. And Willie Goins said, quote, we belong to the Indian race of people, if any to my knowledge. The reputation of my family is that our ancestors came from Cumberland County, North Carolina. A man named Hamilton McMillan, who was a witness for the defendants, said, quote, I am familiar with the Act of 1885 designating certain Indians of Robeson County as Croatan Indians. I introduced the bill myself. They call themselves Melungeons. McMillan saying, these people call themselves Melungeon, but then they're there calling themselves Indian. This legal struggle brought to the forefront the questions of race, heritage, and the definition of Indian identity. Plaintiffs are trying to prove their Indian lineage so the kids can go to this school, like the Goins brothers show. And there's this intricate process of establishing a pedigree. Okay, so here's another one from Norfolk, Virginia, July 15th, 1833. The Superior Court of Norfolk County entered the following minutes, quote, the court doth certify upon satisfactory evidence of white persons produced before it that Asa Price, Wright Perkins, Nathan Perkins, Priscilla Perkins, Nelson Bass, Willie Bass, Andrew Bass, etc. are not free Negroes or mulattoes, but are of Indian descent, and that each of them have a certificate separately thereof. What does that mean in plain English? They're saying that the court got evidence that they found satisfactory in 1833 to say, okay, you're being listed as mulatto or Negro, but we actually are going to give you a certificate that says, no, you're Native American. Quote, that they are not free Negroes or mulattoes, but they are of Indian descent, and that each of them have a certificate separately thereof. Now, what does this remind you of? It reminds me a lot of the CDIB cards, the blood quantum cards. A lot of Native tribes use, a lot of the federally recognized tribes use to kind of say you have to be this much Native American, documented Native American to be enrolled in the tribe. There's so much more. This one, 1857, William Chavis was arrested and charged as, quote, a free Negro. He was charged with carrying a shotgun, which was a violation of North Carolina state law. He was convicted, but then he appealed it that he was, quote, of Indian descent and a free person of color, not subject to the restrictions that free Negroes had. The appeals court reversed the lower court and said, quote, free persons of color may be then, for all we can see, persons colored by Indian blood. Did fight to say that he didn't have Negro ancestors, but guess what? On the census records for 1850, 1860, 1870, I could keep going on and on. There is a ton of this. But what I want to show you is something that was pretty shocking for me. So my mom's great-grandmother, Lola, her last name was Perot. I think sometimes now people pronounce it Perot, Peralt, but it's all the same family. And there is this document that I found. It was one of our cousins. I can't remember off the top of my head. But we're talking about these affidavits about swearing to their blood and saying, like, I do not have African blood. I'm a Native American. This is from the state of Louisiana, and it's a copy. Parish of Natchitoches, where my family is from. It says, we, the undersigned citizens of Campty, Natchitoches Parish, Louisiana, do solemnly affirm that Joseph Perot is a white man of Spanish and American Indian descent. And it's signed by all of these people, basically saying, this is basically like these certificates that they're talking about. They're saying, okay, oh, well, even if he's listed as mulatto or black, which he was on some of the draft cards or census records, we have this extra piece of paper to say this is what his actual lineage is. And there's two issues with this. I'm sure that if you're tracking with me, you know, the first one is that people are doing everything they can to say they are not Negro in the United States. They are going to court to say they are not Negro. What does that tell you about what it was like to be considered Negro in the United States at that time? The second thing is that we have created a situation now where people have to walk around with a pedigree like we're a bunch of dogs trying to get into a dog show. My kids love our dog. His name's Nacho, and he's an English bulldog. My girls are really into dog shows, and they like watching them and stuff. The pedigree stuff is a big deal. I didn't care about our dog having a pedigree. It just happens that he does, and we got like this stupid piece of paper saying who his parents were and all this stuff. His mom's name was Lola. I thought that was really weird. But that's for dogs. That's for dogs. Like, we don't need to be walking around with a pedigree like that, letting people know, hey, I've got this notarized copy showing that I'm not a Negro. Like, and I'm not even blaming these folks. I'm blaming the situation that is being created by this determination to put people in these boxes. You know, by putting people in these boxes, we've created these situations. And we've created this situation where people are going to feel the need to hide their ancestry because the repercussions are huge. You can see the difference here in that scenario for, I think it was one of the Chavis men. He wasn't allowed to have a shotgun if he was a Negro, but since he's a free person of color who's Native American, he's allowed to have it. And this is a lot of documentation. I feel like it needs to be document heavy because I don't want to just be going off on how I feel and stuff like that. I mean, we're looking at the documents. Now, does this mean every person that has mulatto doesn't have African ancestry? Of course not. Of course not. If we can prove that mulatto has been used for one person who was just of Native American descent, then we have to look at everything now and say, okay, we can't just assume what this ancestry is because of the way we use it now. That's not what was happening then. In the early 1700s of Virginia, mulatto and Indian was actually used interchangeably. Why do we have that column? Here's another one from Chesterfield County, Virginia, April 1770. On the motion of Sybil, an Indian woman who was held in slavery by Joseph Ashbrook, have leave to prosecute for her freedom, and within the same year, the title of the court got changed to Sybil, a mulatto, dismissed. So she went from the Indian woman, and then later on they said she was a mulatto woman. See, like, these terms are just being used interchangeably. And why? Well, maybe it's because different people are taking over, different people just are using different terminology for different things. There wasn't like this standardized approach. And also, how can we standardize terminology for people? How do we do that? You know, at what point now are we going to look and say, okay, if you have 1/16th African ancestry, you get moved from this column to this column. Now there are tons and tons and tons of these, and I owe so much, and I've just been saving them in the document. So this was a lot. I want you to let me know what you think about, has Native American ancestry been erased by mulatto being used